So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Lincolnwood Together. This is one of our many fireside chats. We're very, very excited. Just really briefly, I see a bunch of people tonight that I never met before, and I'm not sure you're on our mailing list. I am going to ask you, please, if you would either put in the chat your email address, you can direct that directly to me so that we can invite you to future events, or if you feel comfortable putting it in the chat, or just send an email to lincolnwoodtogether@gmail.com. We are a group of Lincolnwood residents. We've been meeting for several years now, and we are committed to being an informed, unified, and engaged, and unified community. And in that effort, that's why we have evenings like tonight, where we're so honored to have Nadim Badran with us to talk with us about water safety in Lincolnwood. I want to really briefly do a commercial for the Harris Levitt Memorial Angel Fund, and then we'll get right into our evening program. A few years ago, Lincolnwood Together spun off an angel fund for Lincolnwood. We are a group of residents helping other residents in financial crisis. We take donations through our GoFundMe, and we have helped people with their electric bills, with their water bills, with emergency funds, where they have had no other options. We work directly with the social worker in Lincolnwood, who's part of the police department. They get all the referrals. They help us to identify people in need, and your support means the world to everybody. So I'm going to put the GoFundMe right now in the chat, and any support that you can give, we will be most grateful. We are a 501c3, and so your donation should be tax deductible. I want to acknowledge Luis for organizing this evening, Luis Gross for organizing this evening's chat. It's been really great to have your collaboration and your effort and making this happen. Thank you so much for that. And thank you everybody for being here, especially Nadim Badran. So with that, I'm going to ask that everybody except Nadim mute ourselves and take it away. We are yours. We are here to hear. And if there'll be questions at the end, right?
Absolutely. Questions at the end. Feel free to ask questions throughout too, if anything strikes the moment, interest in the moment. So, all right. Well, I'll go ahead. I'll just take a little bit of, I'll give you a little bit of background on myself. My name is Nadim Badran. I'm the Public Works Director for the Village. I've been the Public Works Director now for a little bit over a year, but I've been with the Village for about 5 years now, previously as the Assistant Director. Prior to coming to the Village of Lincolnwood, I actually worked for the Village of Kenilworth as an analyst over there, and then I moved up to the assistant to the manager role, and then I transitioned over to the Village of Lincolnwood. So I've been in the field now for about 9 years. Started in 2013, and I got my master's of public administration from Northern Illinois University, which for anyone who's really familiar with local government, that's kind of the go-to school for city management in this area. So that's a little bit about me. I know the purpose of the discussion tonight is to talk about the quality of our water, as well as some of the infrastructure work that we're doing to improve our infrastructure. And then additionally give some background on some of the new federal and state regulations that have passed that are going to have a big impact on the village. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I have not yet done this on Zoom, so hopefully all goes well. With a brief PowerPoint, and as I said earlier, if any questions come up throughout the way, feel free to just interrupt me and go ahead and ask. So let's see if we can do this. Okay, does everyone see the PowerPoint? Fantastic. So to go ahead and just give a little bit of background on our water supply, as I'm sure everyone here is familiar, the village does receive water from the city of Evanston. Prior to 2020, prior to August of 2020, water was being received from the city of Chicago. For that decade between 2010 to 2020, Chicago just increased their wholesale rates to the village per 1,000 gallons without much justification or reasoning behind the increases. And what we saw in the period of 10 years was an increase of 103%. So about midway through that decade, the village board had begun looking at alternative water suppliers in the area so that we could move away from Chicago to a more stable source in the sense of mitigating those severe increases each year. So ultimately, the village selected the city of Evanston, and construction began in 2019 to build a 3-mile long transmission main that runs up to the city of Evanston, and it was completed in August of 2020. For context on how high Chicago's rates just were, Evanston's rate for us upon completion of the project was $1.60 per 1,000 gallons of water. So versus Chicago's rate at the time of $4.08 per 1,000 gallons. So this was a $12.7 million project, which sounds astronomical, but it's actually being paid for by the annual savings that we are experiencing by switching to the tune of about $1.2 million per year. So the debt service on the 20-year bond to fund that project is about $700,000, and in a few years it'll kick up to be about $1 million, but ultimately it's being entirely funded by the savings of switching over. So we'll get to those savings and what we're using them for a little bit later in the presentation, but I know the real true reason we're all here tonight is to really talk about the quality of the water and the dependability of the water. So Evanston treats its water very similarly to the way Chicago does, both of which are really high quality producers of potable water. Both are very highly regulated by the Illinois Department of Public Health, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, and most importantly, the Environmental Protection Agency. So there's a significant amount of testing that goes into being able to produce water and then sell it to other communities. And then we have our own set of testing that we have to adhere by to make sure that we maintain a compliance to continue pushing out potable water to our residents. So in addition to Lincolnwood, Evanston provides water to about 450,000 customers, provide water to the Village of Skokie, the DuPage Water Commission, the Morton Grove Niles Water Commission, and of course, Lincolnwood. So the way the process works this is kind of the Cliff Notes version, if you will, for the treatment procedure over in the city of Evanston. It starts with it begins by taking water through their suction wells from the lake. Those wells have various size grading and netting along the way that removes any of the larger debris. After that water makes its way into the Evanston water plant, there's a series of low lift pumps essentially lift that water up to a height where it can then proceed through the plant via gravity. The water then goes from that point to the mixing basins, and that's really where the treatment of the water begins. So you could say the treatment of the water really begins, removing those large items, seaweed, things like that, plants, whatever it may be, and unfortunately, a variety of other pollution that finds its way into the lake. But then really when it enters the mixing basins is when it starts getting treated with chemicals and the suspended solids begin to be removed from the water. So at that point, very carefully measured levels of fluoride, chlorine, and aluminum sulfates are added. The aluminum sulfates cause those suspended smaller solids, those microscopic solids, to sink and settle out of the water to begin removing those smaller contaminants that are a little bit harder to get out through a filtration process. So the water then enters the slow mixing basins where additional treatments are added and additional suspended solids are removed. And then it makes its way to the settling basins where, as its name implies, all those suspended solids settle to the bottom. The clarified water gets pulled through, and about 90% of the impurities are removed at that point. And it sits in those basins for anywhere between 4 and 8 hours. At that point, water then goes through the filtration system. So it's already been about 90% treated, and the last bits of bacteria and impurities or anything else are treated, filtered out, and then it makes its way into the high lift pumps, which then pump water out into the system, into the various end users in the community. So as I mentioned, at that point, the water makes its way, at least for the village of Lincolnwood, down the 3-mile transmission main that we had just installed to our pump house, where it enters our underground storage detention tanks at the pump house located at Crawford and Schreiber. And at that point, the village, we rechlorinate the water because chlorine dissipates over time and distance and with temperature. So the EPA standard is 5 parts per million. We get the water from Evanston at about 6 parts per million. If we were to then pump that out into our system, we would drop below that 5 parts per million threshold, especially as it makes its way to the further northwest portions of town. So with that, we inject chlorine gas into the water, which then rechlorinates it to a level of about 1.2 parts per million, so that when it makes its way through the farthest points of the system, it begins, it arrives at about that 0.6, 0.7 parts per million, which is where we want it at. So going back to Evanston, all their treatment process, all their testing, everything is overseen by, they have a variety of water system operators who oversee various components of the process. But most importantly, they have a full-time chemist and a full-time microbiologist who constantly check the quality of the water and for impurities and just for bacterial levels, whatever it may be. And they put together all that reporting, and that reporting gets submitted to the Illinois Department of Public Health. The Evanston treatment facility is certified by the Illinois Department of Public Health, and it is routinely inspected by the IDPH to ensure compliance. So that's kind of where our water comes from, why we transitioned from Chicago to Evanston, how Evanston treats it, how they pull it in from the lake, and how it makes its way over to the village. Once it makes its way to Lincolnwood, all the testing you see here, and a little bit of more testing actually occurs with the city of Evanston because they are a production facility. We are a distributor. So for context, Evanston's water plant operators need to be Class A certified operators, which means they are responsible for the oversight of producing water for potable consumption. The village of Lincolnwood, our water system operators, we require a Class C operation, which is responsible for the maintenance and distribution of that water and ensuring that it maintains that quality, but we're not the ones bringing it up to that quality. So the way the village tests it is we test for a variety of different components, compounds, and chemicals. Of course, lead and copper is the big one in the news today. It was specifically lead. Due to everything that's happened in Flint, Michigan. And ultimately, the EPA has ruled more or less lead is not in any level safe for human consumption. Currently, the standard in the IEPA standard is 15 parts per billion is the action level. So a home that tests for lead at 10 parts per billion or even 14 parts per billion, that's considered acceptable by EPA standards. Now, but the EPA is beginning over the next few years to reduce that down to 10 parts per billion. It's eventually going to make its way to 5 parts per billion until we get to the point where it's at 0. One very important thing to note is that the village's primary distribution system does not include lead pipes. We include our water distribution systems, so our water mains are ductile and cast iron. Where lead enters the system are service lines that begin to enter people's homes. So we'll touch on that in just a minute. I have a diagram in here about what the service line is, ownership of it, and what the new legislation requires as part of replacing those service lines. So one thing that Evanston and Chicago before, and pretty much any production plant that produces water in an area where there's lead services, they add a polyphosphate to the water. That polyphosphate, the purpose of that is it helps coat more or less the inside of those pipes and those services to prevent lead from leaching into the water. So that's why when you're testing for lead in your home or wherever, when we test for lead, we take a variety of samples at a variety of different times after drawing the water. The initial first draw from a faucet that sat overnight in a home that had a lead service or has galvanized piping inside the house, that's going to test likely above 15 parts per billion for lead. You let that water run for 10 to 15 seconds, that next sample is going to be a little bit lower. You let that water run for about 5 minutes, and then you likely won't test for, you'll have a very low number, if any number at all, for lead, just because at that point, that the new water is flowing through that has that polyphosphate in it. It hasn't just been sitting in that lead pipe. Historically, the village has had exceptional lead testing. So we test for lead 60 different sites throughout the course of the year, as required by the EPA. Before switching to the city of Evanston, our history was so good that we were only required to test once every 3 years for lead by the EPA. We went above and beyond. We did more than that, but that was our requirement because the village has such a good history of being below those 15 parts per billion at a various number of those sites. So the reason that we do it annually now is because we switched water suppliers, and that triggered a testing requirement. So now we have to test those 60 sites per year. We're actually going to begin the EPA is going to begin requiring that we can, or allowing the village to kind of back down on the amount of testing that we're doing. But because of lead and because of the fact that this lead line legislation passed, we want to just continue maintaining our standard and staying where we're at. So even though the EPA is not requiring us to, we're going to continue testing for lead as we have been to make sure that we're maintaining that 95th percentile, meaning that 95% of our testing sites are all below that threshold requirement. When the change kicks in, which I believe it kicks in 2024 to 10 parts per billion, we're likely going to see our number of sites not in compliance go up by 1 or 2. Right now, last year in our last round of testing, we had 3 sites. 2 sites were just above the 15 parts per billion threshold. 1 site was well above. It was like about 500 parts per billion. And the reason is when we did the draw, we did the test, it was pulled from a home that sat vacant for a couple of weeks. And as a result, that water was very highly, that first draw had a lot of lead. So that kind of being the outlier, we had those 2. And then we had about 3 sites that tested between 10 and 15. So we anticipate we're going to kind of fall to about 5 sites that we will see testing above the standard per year. So I'm sure we're going to talk more about lead, but moving on to the other tests the village conduct, we also, again, we closely monitor our chlorine level to make sure that we're maintaining above that 0.5 parts per million. But we also want to make sure that we're not going too high. We want to be below 1.5 parts per million, because at that point, your water will smell like pool water. So we want to make sure that we're keeping it below that level. We test for a variety of phosphates. As I mentioned, Evanston adds those phosphates to the water. We also want to make sure the levels are not too high as we begin pumping them out to our community. We test for bacteriological samples. Probably the most frequent testing we do is bacteriological samples. So we do it multiple times per week. Just to ensure that E. coli or other coliforms are not entering the water system. We test them at various sites throughout the village. We try to rotate so we're not constantly testing the same sites over and over. Disinfectant byproducts, those are your disinfectant byproducts, if you will. And this is where actually we have various trihalomethanes, various acids, things that are cancer risks, things like that we routinely test for as well. And if anyone received the Lincolnwood newsletter yesterday, the detection of PFAS it falls under the next category of the unregulated contaminants. So a couple of weeks ago, a week ago, Evanston notified the village that they found 2 parts per trillion of PFAS in their water. PFAS stands for polyfluoroalkyl materials. And essentially what they are is there are over 5,000 different type of man-made chemicals produced since the 1940s that essentially are found in like non-stick pans or water-resistant materials, firefighting foams, oil-resistant materials. If you check on the EPA's website, the EPA acknowledges these materials, these PFAS or PFAS are everywhere. They're in fish, they're in water, they're in the air, they're in the ground, they're in us. It's such an abundant chemical that's made its way into pretty much every system that it could have made its way into. So more or less anyone who's going to be testing for this is likely going to detect that type of, or that material. The level of detection that Evanston found was 2 parts per trillion. So when we're talking chlorine, we're talking 2 parts per million. When we're talking lead, we're talking parts per billion. And then with PFAS, we're talking parts per trillion now, which is the equivalent of 1 drop of water in 20 Olympic swimming pools. So it's a very, very, very small level of detection. Fortunately for us, the ability to detect these type of chemicals, the technology that goes into that gets better year after year. Unfortunately, it moves faster than the technology we have to treat what we find. So right now, there is no required action by the EPA or the IEPA. The federal EPA states that 70 parts per trillion is the level of concern. The discussions the state's having are that they're going to try to keep it down closer to that under 10 parts per trillion. But the problem is removing PFAS from the water, it will not be removed through traditional treatment measures because of how small it is. It's going to require some sort of reverse osmosis type system or activated carbon treatments, all the things that Evanston, the city of Chicago, Winnetka, Glencoe, that basically the water plants that have been constructed for decades just do not have the ability to treat right now. So we're talking investments of significant amounts of money, millions of dollars into the technology that's going to be needed to begin treating that. So right now, Evanston's following the EPA recommendation of, well, you've detected it in your water, start thinking about ways, notify the public that you found it, which is our obligation to do, and start looking at ways you can begin treating it or what technologies you'll need, put together a plan, essentially. So that PFAS detection falls under a testing that the village has that a variety of different communities have to do per the EPA, called the unregulated contaminant monitoring regulations, which is the UCMR 4, UCMR 5, which are basically the EPA's way of finding out what's in our water. So it's their way of looking at, okay, we're going to make you test for all of these different things. For example, UCMR 5 that we're going to begin testing for next year, one of the things they're looking at is, are there levels of lithium in the water? So and if so, what is the impact on the human body and what we should be doing about that? So unfortunately, as time goes on, more things work their way into our water systems, our lakes, our ponds, our rivers, and those things ultimately can find their ways into our drinking water. And we have an obligation to treat those and do our best to remove them from the system. And then in addition to that, we do test for the base water quality parameters like hardness, iron, alkalinity, pH, and various sulfates. We are required to submit all of this testing to the IEPA at regular intervals, who then allow us to continue operating our water distribution system. Had we had any issues with any of these, if we failed, the EPA actually requires us to do a village-wide notification that we did not meet our obligation to monitor the water. So fortunately, that has not happened yet. I don't intend to ever let that happen in my time as a director here, and we've had a good, strong record with that so far. So I guess before we move on from the quality of our water and the way we treat it, because now we're going to kind of get into infrastructure. Are there any questions on the water production process or water filtration process or testing processes?
I had a question, but I don't know if it falls exactly under under those categories. I heard what you said, that the ability to detect problems at this point is farther along than the ability to treat them. Would it be then the consumer's responsibility to use different kinds of filters or things in our own homes if we have those concerns?
So there are filters that treat PFAS. Like there are filters that remove water from the system. So really where it comes into play is what is the federal or the state regulation at the time. Now, for example, the new lead service line replacement and notification act that just went into effect in January actually requires the village to provide a water filter, a 6-month water filter that's capable of removing lead as a point of use treatment until that lead can be removed once there's an issue identified. So if it's testing above the maximum allowable limit, or if there's disruptance to a service line as part of a construction project, because with that new law, if you disrupt the lead pipe, the village actually has an obligation now to replace the private portion of the lead pipe as well into the home. So not just our section. So for something like PFAS, right now there's no federal regulation or state regulation that says this is what you need to do if you detect it, because it's still under review, under investigation. And there will be rules coming out soon, and those rules will dictate what the communities have to do. But as of right now, there's no set standard for how to respond to that detection outside of notify the community and continue working towards a solution and investigating solutions.
So yeah, as some of you know, I work for federal EPA. Sadly, I just do air pollution. So this is all really interesting and new to me. But I did talk with a colleague this afternoon mentioning that we were going to have this conversation tonight, and she's working on PFAS issues. And just one of the things I learned is, even though like it's a little bit scary because we know it's not a good thing, right? But we don't know how much of it is needed for it to be a really bad thing, right? And there's just a lot of studies that have to be done on the one hand. On the other hand, we know it's not good. So I just mentioned that there's a real period of uncertainty, and that doesn't mean that we wait until, you know, we've got serious illness that can be directly linked. But just want to point out that we're just, at least Nadim, this is what I understand, we're still really, you know, in the learning curve as far as how much of a risk is this really, and what populations need to be particularly concerned.
Yep, absolutely. We just started, I believe, testing for PFAS really kind of kicked off and began in 2018. So it's a relatively new compound that's being tested for. So, you know, again, the ability to detect it is there, but then, as you mentioned, you know, what do you do once you detect it? What is the impact at those levels? What is the safe level? Because as we see with lead, you know, 15 parts per billion at one time was considered a safe level. But as you know, medicine and science have progressed, we've determined, no, really, you should not have any lead in your system at all. So that's why, and now it's going to be a phased reduction of the level of lead that's acceptable in water. So I imagine the same is going to be true for PFAS chemicals.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat that asks, it asks, how do we know if our water is from a line that is lead? And how are testing sites chosen in the village? Those two questions came in.
So testing sites are chosen at random, but we want to test sites that we know have lead. So we take a list of sites that we know have lead and copper. We don't want just copper because when we do the test, we test for lead and copper at the same time. So we want to have test sites that have both, essentially. And we submit that list of a couple of hundred homes or addresses to the EPA. The EPA then selects, or the IEPA then selects 60 of those sites and tells the village, you need to test here. If one of those homeowners refuses to let you in or let you do the testing at their site, here's your backup list. So we kind of give them our inventory and they tell us, okay, these are the places you have to pick from. A really good tool that residents can use is you can always call Public Works, and I'm happy to talk to you and look up your record on your home, or our frontline staff can do that as well. But you can also go on our village website, and under the water billing portion of the website, there's a search bar at the very bottom that's community portal. You type into your address into that community portal, and it'll give you a lot of details on your home. And specifically, you know, it'll pull up, it'll take you to a different website, which is our GIS program, and it'll have various tabs that show garbage day, street sweeping day, who your elected officials are. And then there's a tab that says water service line material. You click that and it'll tell you what the public and private side are if we've been able to do an inspection or update it based on our records. There are homes where we don't know and we're trying to actually do those inspections now, but we do have a good chunk. We have about 75% of our inventory collected. So we know about 75% of the homes in the village.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions before we move on to the next section?
Yes, there's one more. It says, if we are out of town for a couple of weeks, should we run our water for 5 minutes to be sure there's no lead? Should we run our water for a few seconds each time we're using it?
It's always a good, if you know that you have a lead service line, or if you have galvanized piping, because galvanized piping does include lead in it, which a lot of homes have galvanized piping as their internal piping in the house. It is a good idea to let your faucet run for, you know, at least a minute or two if you're routinely using your water. If you've been out of town for a while and you're coming back, then yes, I would absolutely recommend that you let your water run for at least 5 minutes before you use it for consumption.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. That's all I got right now.
All right.
There's another question, I think.
Yeah, let's see.
Sorry, I missed that. Just came on.
What is the impact of flushing your expired medicines and old prescriptions down the drain?
So there's no, well, it's the very first, it's why PFAS is in water, right? So that flushing those things down the drain is going to make its way through to the sewer system, which will then make its way to the MWRD treatment facility, who will then treat it. And then the treated water goes into the North Shore Channel, actually. That's how things like PFAS make its way into the water, because it was being treated at a time that was not able to treat those types of chemicals in it, and it was undetected essentially. So this will have no impact on the water you drink tomorrow when you turn your faucet on, but this is something that could be affecting, people down the line, generations down the line, which is like the case with PFAS. And the reason the EPA says that it's in the air, in the ground, in the fish, in the water, is because since the 1940s, this chemical has been being put back, or these chemicals, because over 5,000 different chemicals that make up PFAS, have just been put back into the environment. And that ultimately finds its way back to our water sources and then back to our homes. So.
Thank you.
I have a question. Regarding lead service and galvanized pipes, what is the kind of the theory that a lot of the minerals over the years and calcium deposits will actually line our pipes somewhat naturally and prevent lead from entering into the water?
I've heard that. I've heard that before. I don't think that there's any type of study that necessarily backs that up, because even with putting in a specific compound, that those polyphosphates into the water to coat that line, homes will still have significant levels of lead if that water has been sitting for a while. So I think, in a lot of these cases, lead services before the really are found in homes that were built or constructed before the 1980s, because around 1985, I believe, is when lead became banned. So at this point, we have homes that are still testing with higher lead levels, 10 parts per billion, 15 parts per billion, and those homes have been there for 70 years. A home built in the 1950s has been there for 70 years now. It's being treated with the polyphosphate, and it's still having detectable levels of lead. So I think that there's probably not a whole lot of, and I can't say that I've looked too deeply into it, but I can't imagine that would be an acceptable measure of removing or mitigating lead from your system. All right, well, if there's no more questions on that, which we'll still touch on lead just a little bit as we get into the next section, we'll move on to our next category here, which is our much needed infrastructure improvements. So as I previously mentioned, the transmission main project is yielding about $1.2 million in savings. About 700,000 of that is being applied to the debt service on that project due to the fact it was a $12.7 million project. And the remainder of those savings are really being applied toward replacing our distribution mains. So in 2018, the village board formed the ad hoc infrastructure committee that worked with staff and our engineers to evaluate our infrastructure needs. And what we saw was, from a period between 1997 to 2002, so over that 5-year period, the majority of our roads were resurfaced. And really since that point in time, not a whole lot of other infrastructure work has gone on. So, roadway has an average lifespan of about 20 years. So you want to get on a 20-year resurfacing cycle. And what we found was in 2018, all of our roads were kind of coming up to the end of their useful life at the same time. That prompted staff and our engineers to begin looking at the condition of our water mains. And we found that we have a significant number of very old water mains, miles of old water mains that have had a number of breaks. And we have, of our 60 miles of water mains, 31 miles of that, so about half, was installed in the 1920s. So these are old cast iron mains that you can see in the picture just to the right. That's a 6-inch main. It's not it's a 6-inch main on the outside, but not on the inside. So those are the types of things that those buildups and that calcium deposit, everything over time really shrinks down that pipe from a 6-inch down to a 3-inch, 2-inch. And those are things that have an impact on residential water pressure, firefighting pressure from our hydrants. So we want to be, and frankly, at this point, they begin to break. And the picture on the bottom you could see is a main break repair that essentially, when there's a crack or a blowout of a piece of that pipe, it's an extensive process to dig down to it. You lose a lot of water during that process until we shut it off. At that point, we're shutting off water for certain members of the community along that break area. And then we essentially just put a sleeve on it like that just closes it up, and then we backfill it all. So we have about anywhere between 15 to 25 water main breaks per year. They conveniently all happen in the winter at the dead of night when it's 2 in the morning and 0 degrees outside. But that's because of the temperature fluctuations, and that when you have a brittle old pipe, that freeze thaw that may happen in the soil around it is enough pressure to crack the main and cause the water to leak. So at the time, the ad hoc infrastructure committee said, we have to do something about our water mains. So let's put a plan in place over the next 10 years that as we're resurfacing our roads, as we're tearing up the roadways, we're also going to begin replacing our poor rated water mains and 15% of our fair rated water mains that were installed in the 1920s. Because believe it or not, a lot of our 1920s water mains are in better quality, better condition than the mains that were installed in the 1950s. Because my understanding, and according to our engineers, is it was all heavy materials and metals, things like that, were being directed to the war, and therefore the production of other things kind of suffered here. So that's why the majority of our breaks that occur each year are on our 1950s water mains. So that is the infrastructure program that's currently in place right now. Last year we completed about 2.8% or 2.8 miles of new water, or to date we've completed about 2.8 miles of new water main. I apologize. But it is an extensive project. It's going to be about $26 million over the course of this program. And it's going to have to be funded through bond issuances, the savings from switching suppliers. And if anyone's been paying attention to the recent village board meetings, we're also looking at potentially increasing the residential water rate, just because when the transmission main project went forward in 2018, when the contract was approved, the village board desired to freeze that water rate until 2023, so that some of those savings can be enjoyed by the community before being put towards these very much needed infrastructure improvement programs. So the last time the water rate was increased was in 2016. But in order to continue funding this project, the village board is now looking through options on what the water rate should be, and they're actually going to be discussing it at their next village board meeting on February 15th. So in addition to this $26 million replacement program that called for a replacement of about 12 miles of water main over the next few years, in August of 2021, the governor signed the Lead Service Line Replacement and Notification Act into law that went into effect January 1st of this year. So the way your water service, your water service is two components. There's the water service takes the water from the village water main to the home. That service line is broken up into two pieces, the part that's owned by the homeowner and the part that's owned by the village. Generally, the village owns the part that you see coming off the water main it's not up to the property boundary, it's actually up to wherever the water meter or the buffalo box is, whichever comes first. The resident owns the remainder of that line from that point into the home. As part of our water main replacement project, as part of our transmission main project where we installed some local distribution main, the village has been, as we install a new water main, we run a new copper service from that new water main to the buffalo box, or to the buffalo box is a shutoff valve, or to the water meter that's in the parkway. From there, we gave residents the option, we negotiated with our contractor a flat fee of $5,000 to have that work done under our village contract. So it would be a private agreement between the property owner and the contract. The village just was kind of offering a hand, and we were able to, because that was part of a $5 million infrastructure program, we were kind of able to dictate to the contractor, you're going to offer this service to residents at a fee of $5,000, because if they wanted the $5 million project, they had to be willing to do that as well. So last year we had 9 homes that took advantage of it. But now, moving forward, the new legislation says, hey, if you put in a new water main, village, city, town, any municipality, you are now responsible for full replacement. You can no longer just replace your service, so you can't do partial service replacements. So actually the village is going to be responsible for the full cost of taking that service from the main all the way into the home, 4 feet or 3 feet into the home, or to the shutoff valve, whichever comes first, I believe is the language specified in the law. So of course, the state did this in anticipation of the federal infrastructure bill passing, which, as we know, it did pass. It allocated $116 million worth of funding to replace lead services to the state of Illinois, which is going to be administered through the IEPA's revolving loan process, which sounds like a good number on the surface, but really that is likely not. I mean, that's the village's replacement lead service line replacement program based on our current inventory is about $16 million right now. So we've just increased our water main replacement program from 26 million to 16 with another 16 million on top of that. So we're pushing over $40 million at this point because of the lead service lines that we have to replace, which is a fantastic public health initiative. It is a guaranteed way to remove lead from the system, but it does come with a pretty significant cost. So since 2017, the village has been working on putting together an inventory and that's why we have that search bar available on our website, because we were anticipating something like this happening. Right now, our inventory is 83% complete, and we have 713 unknown lines remaining. So when I say 713 unknown lines, of course, that is, we have to treat those as lead. So when we're putting our numbers together, and when I reference $16 million, that's because the EPA requires you to treat unknowns as lead. So we have to go into this expecting to pay that much. We're very hopeful that number is going to come down based on preliminary inspections in the parkway. But where we can look in the parkway and see, okay, there's copper coming off the meter in both directions, that's not valid evidence for the EPA. We actually have to get into the home and take a look at the either permit files or get into the home and take a look at where that service line comes into the house. So our staff currently is working right now to try and complete the remaining inspections on those. So the pie chart is just kind of a good way of identifying. Right now we have, we have 2,425 copper services, but you can see in there we have right now about 1,100 lead services. We have of that 713, 612, we've peeked into the meters and we see copper coming off both ends, but the age of the home suggests that it should have lead instead of copper. So that's why we have to actually go inside and do the physical inspection. The true unknowns, those 101, are just 101 properties that we have not yet inspected. So we need to actually begin that inspection. So I kind of got ahead of myself here, but based on that inventory, we're expecting about additional $16 million for all of those replacements. And the village has an obligation under the new law to have this work done by 2042. The most sensible way for the village to approach this, and the way that's going to be the most economically feasible, is to do it through the infrastructure improvement plan. Since we're going to be ripping up our streets already to resurface them, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to repave a roadway, come back a few years later, dig it up again to replace these services. It makes sense to get ahead of it and do it all at the same time. So we'll dig up the road, drop in the new water main, run the new services all the way to the home, and then resurface, and then we're done. We don't have to touch that street again for 20 years. So right now, even though we know the state recently just was notified, municipalities that they're receiving $116 million for this program, we don't know how it's going to be administered just yet. The funding is likely going to be given to communities that are disadvantaged, that don't have the financial means that a village like Lincolnwood does, a greater amount of the funding. So we're working with our engineers to figure out exactly what we can do to put ourselves a little bit higher up on that list. But ultimately, we're looking at, we're going to seek as much grant funding as possible. But right now, we have to anticipate that a lot of this cost is going to have to be paid for locally, which is another reason why we're looking at that water rate increase. And when we talk about that water rate increase, the direction of the village board so far has been, look at a 10-year plan, implementation of a multi-year plan, but reviewing it annually to ensure that our costs are actually matching what our revenue is, so that we're not overcharging residents or not undercharging based on our expenditures as well. So,
Nadim, can I interrupt you there for just a moment? We had another question. Sure. The question, because you're talking about pipe replacement, they're asking, what is the best type of pipe to have in the home?
Copper. Copper is the way to go. Copper is the standard right now, so copper is the best option.
Can I ask a question, Karen?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Hi, Dan.
What about homes that have already had their water main up until the meter replaced with copper, but still have lead to the house? Where do we fall in having, the lead line replaced? Because I know, the street's already been done. And so from our parkway to the home, it's lead. What does the timeline for that look like?
So that's going to be, so as I mentioned, the village is required to have this project completed by 2042. So the goal would be to pick up with where we're at in terms of our resurfacing and water main program. This program is intended to be completed by 2031 or 2032. And then we're going to go from a 10-year program to a 15-year program. So the next program is slated to begin in 2035. At that point, all of the properties that were all the streets that have already been resurfaced, all the water mains already been installed, at that point, those streets will be prioritized as part of that first few years of that program. So if your home was recently resurfaced and the water main was recently replaced, I would anticipate sometime in the late 2030s that you would, mid to late 2030s, that we would come through and replace that line. Now, that being said, that's based on our available funding. If the state comes through and says, Lincolnwood, we love you, congratulations, we're giving you $100 million to do this work, then of course we would try to prioritize getting that done as quickly as we can over just a couple of years. But it is going to be really dependent on what funding is available. But based on our current financial structure, we'd be looking at bringing that into the beginning of the next plan.
I'd just like to remind you that I was born in 1947, so I'll be nearly 100 years old by the time the copper pipe is replaced.
Well, there's still some pipes that are older than you, though. So
yeah.
Well, I would, so yeah, some of these extended time periods are a little strange to think about for those of us who, were born around the time of Dale. But I guess the other thing, Nadim, is from, again, I'm not an epidemiologist, but from what I have read, the big concern about lead ingestion is it's more of a concern with young children and developing brains, like people like Dale and I, we're just, nothing more is going to happen that hasn't happened already. But I think if I were the parent of a young child, I would be more concerned. Mm-hmm. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. That is the big driver of concerns. So lead, when it enters the body, when you drink it, when you ingest it, your body treats it like calcium. So it makes its way into your bones, and when for an infant, a baby, or a young child who's growing, they're more susceptible to that, and the impact that it can have on your brain development as well. So yes, it is the primary concern is the impact on children.
Can people have this? I assume people can have this done privately if they're concerned. Would it be a cost substantially more than $5,000?
Well, it really depends on the length of pipe. So if your water main is on the opposite street side of your house, that run is going to be significantly more expensive than if it was on your side of the home. If you're just digging through grass really to get to it, then it's not going to be that expensive. You make anywhere between $4,000 to $8,000. But when you're digging the road at this point, you're digging down to access a water main that's across the street, you're looking at upwards of $10,000. Our contractor, who ended up winning the job, at a certain point was getting very frustrated with the village that we were requiring them to charge a fee of $5,000 because their fees exceeded that, but they were contractually obligated to do that. So,
thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, in addition to the requirements to replace those services, there's as I kind of touched on in the beginning, that law comes with a lot of additional testing requirements. So. Right now, as I mentioned, we test 60 sites, but that 15 micrograms per liter, 15 parts per million, if you will, or per billion, is going to now be reduced down to 10 parts per billion, which means we are going to begin looking at that in 2022. We're supposed to begin compliance by 2024, but the village, we try to stay a step ahead of this, so we want to begin meeting that threshold level next year. So we're going to work with residents on how to do that. As I mentioned, in 2021, 4 sites exceeded at 15 parts per billion. 2 sites were between 10 and 15. So when we reduce that level down to 10 parts per billion, we're looking at having a couple more homes out of compliance. But that's where the point of use treatment, like giving filters and just public education, things like that come into mind, and we can hopefully help educate the community on flushing your water, running your water before using it, things like that. Additionally, right now the state's also going to require the addition of a 5th sample be taken. Right now, when we draw the samples, if you've been sitting overnight, that water is going to come out of your tap. It's going to be coming through the piping that's in the house already, really not targeting the service line. So the new regulation is actually going to require a 5th sample. You have to let the water run for a while so that the water from the service line actually makes its way into the test kit. So that will likely impact the number of homes out of compliance as well. We just don't know what the impact of that's going to be just yet. And as I mentioned, homes that are out of compliance will be given a 6-month water filter. And then additional measures will have to be taken to mitigate that level of lead in the service. So yeah, that's everything I had. We touched on where our water comes from, how it's treated, and what we're doing to improve our infrastructure. So with that, turn it over again for any questions that you may have. I'm happy to answer anything.
As the questions come in, I just want to thank you. Somebody says, they aren't able to participate live, but they're glad that you're being recorded so that they can watch it at a time when they can listen in the quiet of their home.
And if Nadim turns off his PowerPoint, then we can see everyone.
Sure. I will stop sharing.
You just stop sharing.
There we go. Easy enough. One button.
Thank you.
Great. Questions? Aside from thanking you so much, that was really informative. What other questions do people have or concerns?
I have a question. The water filter 6-month thing, is that we're going to have water filters for 6 months if our water is out of compliance, or is that a continuous thing that you get a water filter that's good for 6 months?
So right now, the law specifies we have to provide the 6-month water filter. And essentially that's it. It doesn't really say what has to be done beyond that. So our attorneys are working with our engineers, all looking to interpret what do we do at that point? We can't just say, here's 6 months of good water and then step away. So it would make the most sense, during that 6-month period, we look to find a way to replace the service. But if the village is not coming through and installing a water main just yet, there's no obligation to replace the service unless the resident wishes to replace their service at their cost, and then the village would replace ours at our cost. So this law came through without a lot of clear detail on what the rules are. So the regulations came through, the law came through, the IEPA has not issued formal rules on how each community is supposed to act. So we're kind of working on what the law says, but we need to get that formal instruction from the IEPA. So we're continuing to monitor what they're putting out. It's the same for funding. As I mentioned, the federal infrastructure bill passed, the state received the money for funding, but they haven't issued rules or criteria or standards yet on how to apply or how to get that funding. So the IEP actually had a year from the date of passage to issue those rules, and they have not yet. So.
And does it make any sense for a homeowner to change the pipes in their house if their service line has lead?
Yeah, so I would say, if your internal piping in your home is galvanized or lead piping, while it may help a bit to replace the service, that water that's still going to be sitting in your internal piping overnight is going to continue to show higher levels of lead as well. So I think if you're having the service line replaced, it would make sense to have the internal piping replaced as well.
And how about the other way around? Does it make sense to change the pipe in your house if the service line is not being changed?
Both will have an impact. Both scenarios will help reduce it. Again, it's kind of how you use the water, right? So if you let that water run for a little bit, it should hopefully flush it out and negate any level of lead. So it does make sense to do it holistically. It doesn't make sense to do it just one piece at a time.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But it's a very costly measure too, though. So if we, if the village does come through and replaces your service to your home, and the village covers that cost, well, replacing internal piping is also no easy feat. It's all behind walls and everything. New piping has to be run. So it's that in itself is also quite expensive process.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about the filter, is this like something that goes in the entry to your whole house for the water? Or are we talking about a pitcher in the refrigerator? I'm having trouble visualizing.
Yep. It's a point of use filter. So it's what you use to consume the water. So it's going to be either a filter that ties onto your spigot, or it's going to be one of the, like a Brita type filter that's certified to remove lead. So that's actually what the village purchased. So we've gone through and we purchased about $2,000 worth of these pitchers, and we have them on hand ready to give out as needed. So, but the ones we purchased were the pitchers.
Sounds like a simple fix.
I've got a question. Do makers of bottled water have any standards to which they're subject? I mean, can we assume that bottled water doesn't have any of these contaminants in there? I've never understood what the deal is on that.
I think it depends on who you talk to. If you talk to a water system operator, or one of the people that works in the Evanston plant, they'll say that their water is 1,000 times better than bottled water. If you talk to one of the bottled water producers, they'll say their water is better. Being kept in a hot plastic bottle is probably not going to be the best for the quality of that water as well. So it's unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that question.
Yeah. I doubt there are standards. I don't know that there are standards for people that bottle water that have to test the water. Just interesting, because some people think just by having bottled water that they can avoid any concerns. So, yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I don't know if, Nadim, if you have done any research on galvanized pipes. Do they all contain lead, or, I mean, some of the galvanized pipes I've worked with in the electrical industry were zinc coated instead of lead. So do all the water pipes, the galvanized, contain lead?
So not necessarily, but my understanding from the American Water Works Association is that the majority of galvanized piping used for plumbing purposes does contain lead, whereas other additional piping, like you mentioned, for electrical work, that often contains zinc in lieu of that. So if you have galvanized piping, the EPA requires us to treat galvanized as lead.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, ever since we've been in the house, we've always had a water filter in our consumable water that supposedly takes it out. So, okay. Thank you.
I think Ray has a question. Ray, did you want to ask a question?
I do. As the Director of Public Works, you probably understand this better than all of us, but we all take public works for granted, not thinking we have to know anything about it. And this was a very wonderful presentation and just giving us an idea of how much there is involved in just the water issue. But my question is, since we're all Woodies sitting here, is there anything else from Public Works that we should really know about right now before we hang up?
Boy, I mean, I could talk about we could talk. I mean, how much time do you guys have? We could talk for hours. So I think we'll keep it seasonal. So I would say, just as a reminder, in the winter months, doing anything you can to keep your sidewalks clear, though it's not the obligation of the residents, but just making sure that we try to keep our sidewalks passable. I do apologize. I think the concern we always get from residents is, I just shoveled out my driveway. You just put all the snow back when the plow came through. Unfortunately, there's really no way of mitigating that. If the plow comes by, it's going to push that sidewalk or that snow to the curb into the sidewalk. The best way to alleviate that issue is the area just to the left of your driveway, if you will, to the left of your apron. You dig a 5-foot extension of your driveway there, and you just dig out some space for the snow. That snow will actually pile up there, and before it makes its way into your apron. So that's one easy solution. But as far as other things going on, I think that we're looking to continue replacing our roadways, continue replacing our water mains, We're working on stormwater relief through our street storage program. So for those of you driving around town, generally east of Lincoln, you may have seen those new berms that are kind of at the residential intersections. They're meant to trap and contain stormwater to help control the flow of it. And as I mentioned, those are the big things we got going on right now. So
thank you.
Thank you. Nadim, there was a question in chat, and then we'll go to Susan Ginsburg. The question in chat
I apologize for being late. I just got off another Zoom. But I do have a question. During this last snow that we had, and we did get a call about the alternate parking, although I always do that anyway, but I have some neighbors who don't do that, and I rang their doorbells and I reminded them about it. And it was a day that the even side was supposed to be, the odd side was supposed to be shoveled, and so you could park on the even side. And so the plow comes and he's plowing on the even side. And so I stopped him and I said, today is an odd numbered day, so you actually should be. He says, what? I don't know what you're talking about. I do both sides. And I go, oh my God. So I think some of your plowers don't know the rules, or, unfortunately, my street is filled with cars that never move. Mm-hmm. So it's hard for them. I understand that. It's really hard. People just don't pay attention, or they don't read, they don't.
So I will say, alternate side parking is always a struggle. So I would try to put it out as much as we can. Yeah. One thing, and I'm hoping that this was what the employee was doing. We do give them direction that even if it is the odd day or the even day, if you see that something on the opposite side has opened up, try to hit that as well, because we don't know if that spot's going to be, or that opening is going to be available the next day. Mm-hmm. A car may park there, someone from out of town doesn't know the regulation may park there. So we really try to target that side of the street on that day, but where we can, they're instructed to try and get any open area they see as well.
Yeah, it's hard. For some reason, my street is just terrible. So, but thank you very much. You guys do a great job.
Thank you.
So the question in the chat was, in your opinion, is it worth using a Brita filtered pitcher?
So filters that remove lead are a specific type of filter. So you can get one that fits into a Brita filter, but you need to make sure that it's actually certified to remove lead from the water. Generally, filters remove any type of bacteria or other, heavier amounts of chemicals that are in the water, things like that. But they're specifically rated filters for lead. Mm-hmm.
And they make one for Brita?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Great. Any other questions? Those are asking good questions. Speak up.
Quick question, which is not related to water, but we opened it up a second ago. So I'm just wondering, can we in Lincolnwood ever imagine that yard waste, that we can rake our leaves into the street like Skokie and Evanston and have them picked up?
So the program from Evanston and Skokie and Wilmette, in speaking with all of their directors, so we did look into implementing this type of a program. Every one of those directors would get rid of it if it wasn't a program that's been in place for a while already at that point. It requires a significant amount of manpower, specialty equipment, and basically for those few months, those departments are doing just leaf collection. Okay. So I think the way that the village worked around that, or worked through not issuing that type of a program, was the unlimited yard waste collection. So essentially, put it in those bags if you can, or in those bins, and just set it out. There's no fee for collecting it. The group will take it. If group misses it, you can feel free to give my office a call. We'll come pick it up just to get it out of there. But yeah, leaves in the street, that's not something that I foresee moving forward at this time. It would require additional staff as well as additional equipment that would come with a heavy cost right now.
Thanks for the explanation.
Mm-hmm.
Great question. Anybody else?
Click. I have a non-water related question, as long as we're going in that.
As long as we're taking advantage.
Purely taking advantage.
Absolutely. Fire away.
So is there any thought given to plowing sidewalks along busy streets. I live on Crawford, and when I shovel and the plow comes by, I have, like 25 feet of heavy, icy, slushy snow to then do. And it is a place that people walk, and it's dangerous. So I'm wondering if there's any thought at all to doing some sidewalk plowing.
There's more than a thought. It's in the proposed budget for next year. The village board actually had requested a pilot sidewalk snow removal program. So we were looking to do it contractually potentially, but the cost for doing sidewalk snow removal contractually is very high. We would target our main areas that have a lot of pedestrian traffic. So unfortunately, our sidewalks throughout the village are generally not ADA compliant except for our main thoroughfares. So, putting a sidewalk snow removal machine on, the carriage walks that are, 18 inches to 2 feet wide, well, it's just going to destroy the curb, destroy the machine, destroy the sidewalk, and destroy the grass. But we can use it along Pratt Avenue for the most part, any 4-foot sidewalk or wider. So right now the pilot program calls for Pratt Avenue in its entirety, Crawford, generally in its entirety, and sections of Tui kind of by the overpass, and then of course the areas around our municipal facilities on Lincoln. And the goal is to see right now, the Public Works Department is fairly small in Lincolnwood. For the amount of services that the department provides, it's fairly small. There's 18, members of the bargaining unit, and then about 5 supervisors. So when a snow event happens, especially something that's ongoing, we try to break it up into 2 shifts, 2 12-hour shifts if we can. So it's all hands on deck for snow removal. So we really can't afford to take someone off of a plow for an extended period of time because it's going to impact how quickly we clear the streets. So what we're looking at with this program is hiring a winter seasonal staff member who that person's sole responsibility would be plowing the sidewalk. So we'll see how successful we are with the program this year. It's a pilot program. If we can see that we can take on more and that we can get a lot done during the regular course of business days, then we'll absolutely expand it. I think that's the goal and the desire of the village board, is to do as much as we can. But right now it's going to be an interesting year figuring out what we can accomplish with this program, this position, and this equipment. So.
Oh, I'm so glad I asked. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Nadim, we had another question in the chat. Are wood chips available for residents?
So, unfortunately not. And it's just due to the things that get mixed in with wood chips. We don't want someone, it would be a nice way to be able to provide that back to the community. Right now, there's not a program just because of liability concerns. If, someone gets hurt, who picks them up, how are they delivered, things like that. It is something that we looked into last year. Some other member communities of our insurance cooperative do have a program like that. So while it's not something yet, it's something that we may be continuing to look into to see if it's a program we can continue offering. We probably would just have to do some sort of filtering process to make sure that we're not putting anything harmful in with those wood chips. So.
Thank you. I want to remind everybody, I put the address to contribute to the Angel Fund. The GoFundMe is in the chat. Please be sure to jot that down. And also, I wanted to mention a couple other things that we have in the works, but also I wanted to tell you, Nadim, that there are some messages just thanking you for the presentation, saying that it was very informative, that we really appreciate everything that you've taught us this evening. Are there any other questions for Nadim? People are saying, I don't know if you can see the chat, they're saying, loved it, thank you so much, great presentation, thanks for all the information. There's lots and lots of thank yous coming in. If you are here with Lincolnwood Together for the first time and you did not receive an email, please send an email to lincolnwoodtogether@gmail.com or send me a direct message with your email address so that we can inform you in the future. Nadim, I want to thank you so much for being with us. And if you'll let me just do a quick commercial before I do that, I just wanted to let everybody know we are working with Ram Villivalam's staff right now to do a workshop or an evening chat on election just everything related to elections, election rules, election safety, election fairness. We're looking at, some of us are really interested in getting money out of politics, and we're going to be forming a little committee to support him and working on some kind of legislation regarding that. So if that's interesting to you, please make note of that. Paula has been trying to get in touch with the people who trained, okay, I'll see if I say this right. You know, the hostage situation that happened in Texas in the synagogue. There is an organization that the rabbi had been trained by that really heavily informed his beautiful managing of that situation. Paula is in contact with the people who provided that training to see if we can bring a training like that to Lincolnwood. We would probably need to work with some of our local synagogues, and that's something that she's trying to get going. So please, if you don't get emails from us and you're interested in this kind of programming, give me your email address so we can inform you directly. I don't send junk, I don't send a lot of stuff, just a reminder about an event, and that's all you'll get from us. And along those lines, Nadim, just to thank you so much. It means, you know, we are a group of residents and we're all about being informed and engaged and unified. And the collaboration on the part of the village to be willing for you to come and talk with us. We're a small group, but a lot of people will watch the video later. It means the world. You know, everything is local. Everything is local politics. You know, our lives, you know, we're talking about the water that we drink. Like, it doesn't really get more pertinent than that. And thank you so much for taking your time on an evening. And thank you to your bosses and to the village board and to everybody for making you available to us tonight.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so
We're all
much.
applauding for you. We hope that you'll join us again and spread the word among your colleagues that we're friendly and that we just want to learn. So,
absolutely. And if I may say, it was a pleasure talking to you all tonight. And, you know, feel free to give my office a call anytime you have a question about anything. Just a phone call away. You know, my philosophy is the more transparent we can be, the more information we can put out there, you know, the more you all can also help spread that information, and it builds that trust in us as a village officials. So thank you very much for your time this evening. I was happy to engage with you.
Awesome. Thanks again. Thanks to Louise for helping to facilitate this, and also to Darlene for the flyer. Nobody knows anything if Darlene doesn't make a flyer. So thank you very much for your